And then I got on YouTube and saw that you were already live. I'm like, man, you don't quit, Jesse.
And then we'll wrap up our conversation today with some rapid fire questions.
Oh, goody. I was wondering what those are.
Hello and welcome to the Durham Talents Channel. My name is Jesse Durham. For today's interview, I get to sit down with my friend Tricia Miller. She's been on a roundtable episode recently. You can find her there. But today we're talking about her origin story, how she learned about infinite banking, how she vetted infinite banking, how she applied it, and how she's actually now a professional in the space. And that's how we get to know each other. So tune in and I hope that you enjoy. All right, Tricia, we've already been talking today a couple of times, so it's just right back into it for us. But I do want to go to the beginning. So we've been talking earlier today about the nuances of infinite banking. But if you would take us back to your beginning, any starting point that you want, okay, to where you were exposed to infinite banking, give us some backstory. I'm just going to leave it to you. You start where you want to start, and then I'll ask questions as they occur to me.
Oh, I mean, there's so many places I could start, right? But first, let me just say thank you, Jesse, for having me on here. I really appreciate this opportunity. Goodness, so many things contribute, but I think to not go too far back, I was a stay-at-home mom for 25 years. I raised my kids, homeschooled them, wound up divorced with 7 kids. Not what I expected, not anybody's plan. Wound up having to go to work. Didn't really have a career path because of having been a stay-at-home mom, but wound up working for a couple of area churches as a children's director. I did love and enjoy so much of that. But ending up divorced without a whole lot of, earning power, a lot of years in front of me, all of that was far more limited than my peers, let's put it that way, right? And I knew it. That immediately, along with some family crises that happened, all of those things combined kind of put me on a path of, I've got to figure something out. I'm not going to be able to take the traditional path of go to school, get a good job, earn all of this income, set aside a pile of money, and then hope that one day I can live off the interest, right? Like that was kind of what we typically think of as just saving. Well, I didn't have any savings started, and here I was 25 years in already with, a bunch of kids in tow. So I realized that I was going to have to do some learning. I started studying. I'd always had a little bit of a fascination with real estate. We had actually had a rental property before in the military. We had moved out of homes and rented them, but none of them had been purchased, of course, with like the idea of renting in mind, which makes a big difference, right? How you purchase a property. So we had never really done very well with that. But I started studying that because I realized, and then in my studies, I'll just say this, some of the books that I read, which were totally instrumental to my understanding. One was Robert Kiyosaki's Rich Dad, Poor Dad, and then Cash Flow Quadrant. I read both of those, as well as The Richest Man in Babylon, which is probably my all-time favorite. But in that, I realized that what I was really needing if I was ever going to not be working for the rest of my life, although I have since become an ardent, I don't like the term retirement, put it that way, right? But in order to generate some passive income for later on in life, I was going to need some cash flow, which is different than an accumulated pile of money, right? So it kind of put me on that path of trying to create other streams of income that would create cash flow that I could one day live on. So that's where it kind of went first into real estate. And I flipped a couple of houses with my son, worked our tails off for a whole year, flipping 2 properties. But while I am doing that and we're painting and we're, tearing down walls and building up walls and mudding and all the things that we had to do to renovate these couple of houses, I'm listening to podcasts. and really getting an incredible education from podcasts. And I think that is something that is just really kind of a new phenomenon to our this generation, right? Is that so much information is available. And of course, you've got to, kind of cut through and use a lot of discernment. But I did learn a ton about real estate that way. And then I started learning about money in different ways. Came into this idea of velocity banking, which kind of piqued my interest in the sense that it started to show me that there's ways in which you can manage your money that can make a difference without even making more income, right? Just what you do with your money, how you treat that money. And so, but that I think it was somewhere putting it in the search on YouTube, velocity banking. Eventually, somehow the algorithms found me, or just got above, found infinite banking. And I was like, well, what's the difference between infinite banking and velocity banking, right? So I started looking into that further, learned Nelson Nash's story, found out about, the discoverer of the concept, and then started looking for who is somebody who knows about Nelson Nash and what he taught, who was closest to him. And at the time, the first person I found was James Neathery. So I called up James Neathery's office, had a great conversation with his sister Julie, who answered the phone, and she was so amazing and just made me feel like, oh, these are my people. I am at home. And it's kind of like the rest is history if you want to put it that way. But I dove in head first, got myself a pretty good sized policy right off the get-go, compared to my income, which is probably, I might be a little bit more aggressive minded than some people. You can even when I look at what I did with real estate, I'm like, I was all in. I was always all in, but I was all in with a little bit of like, I don't think I'm going to tell anybody I'm doing this just yet. I got to make sure this is real. So I did kind of keep it a little bit quiet for a while, make sure that I didn't do something foolish, because, sometimes you're just like, is this really for real? Like, can you really do this? Why haven't I ever heard of this before? And of course, people say that a lot, right? When you start teaching this concept, it's like, why haven't I heard of this before? Well, I think that's actually a really good question. Why haven't people heard about this? Who is it that doesn't want us to know about this? But I've been doing it for 6 years now personally, and have finally, I kept referring so many people to James, and he's my mentor now, right? And it was like, okay, I am so excited about what I have found. I cannot not share this with as many people as I possibly can, because it is just, I can just see it's already transforming the way I think about money and how my finances are working. And the guarantees are right there in front of you, and you can see the future is just so much better.
Awesome. So this is me jumping ahead, but it's because you said it earlier today. And I would encourage everybody that when you finish with this interview recording, that you should go listen to that roundtable episode where Tricia's sharing more personal, more professional background. But one thing that you said in the video that I'm referencing, Tricia, was about, because I asked you, how would you encourage someone to get the best out of their agent or their advisor? And my takeaway from what you shared was being hungry. So here's what I'm noticing about your story is, well, you were that kind of person. You were very hungry. You were reading the books. You were making the phone calls. You were listening to the podcast. You were doing the deep dives on the things that interested you. So I just feel like that is so very true. I feel like it's so very integral, and you're reminding me of it again. So, all right, but that's me jumping ahead. I want to go back. All right, so can you give me a bit of an idea about the age spread? And I was one of 11 kids growing up. You and I have talked about some of these things, homeschooling, big families, and I look forward to sharing that here with everybody. But paint the picture a bit more for me. What was the age spread roughly on the kiddos when you got launched into being a professional and getting a job? And paint the picture for me.
Well, like after homeschooling, post-divorce, and going to work and all of that.
Yeah, so say right at your divorce time where you start getting, that you're working at the church and things.
My youngest was 8. So I do believe that would have had my eldest at right around 22.
All right, that helps me. All right, that helps me. Yep, yep. So young kids all the way up to early adults, okay? And you picked up a job at the church. So let's say so I love getting in your mind, everybody, that I want to know what was already there. All right. So when you step into working while managing the home, like what was the money message in your life, say up to that point? What were you showing up with there that was already your programming or your perspective or your take or, your approach to personal finance in general, let's say?
Well, that's a good question. I have not really, I don't know that I've ever thought through that, but I think I did have a pretty traditional bent in that, um, although, we as a family always struggled a little bit with being in debt. So we were always trying to pay off debt and try to climb out of it. And we would at times, I can't tell you how many times we climbed out of it, right?
Okay.
We would fall right back into it. And how did that credit card get back up there again? I mean, I remember having charts on the wall that went around the whole room, and we would X off every month and we did the snowball method, right? And we were real diligent about that. But yeah, credit card debt was always, and of course, we had 7 kids on one income, military family, started out enlisted. My husband eventually became an officer. That helped a lot, but it wasn't, it wasn't anything extravagant by any means. So by and large, I would say pretty traditional. At least we had a steady income being military, right? That was the one thing you could count on, that income coming in. We weren't going to face somebody like so many people do with a job loss, right? We had that security there. Um, but I think there is something, if you go even back further in my story, that has really always been in me a little bit. And that is because I grew up, my dad owned a restaurant. It had been his dream. Like, so I was the oops baby later on in life. So he'd already worked like 18 years on the railroad, and he finally got his dream of opening up his own restaurant. So my mom and dad worked very hard, and I was like 1 year old, I think, when they bought that. So I grew up in the family business, you know, eating lots of ice cream, sleeping on the freezer at night because we were there 7 days a week, 10 a.m. to 10 p.m. That was life. It was on one hand, it was a hard life because we were always at the business. We were not a family that took vacations. I think there was 1 2 week family vacation in my entire life that I remember. The rest of the time, my parents were working. So that was tough. But it was also exciting, right? There was like this element of it was our life. So our customers were our family. I mean, there was a fun piece of that as well, and we would get real excited in the summertime when business was going great. We were an ice cream stand. We'd have the line all the way around the outside of the restaurant building, for as far as you could see sometimes, with people lining up to get ice cream in the summertime. And so there was an enjoyable piece of that as well. But man, it was hard work. But I do think that kind of gave me a little bit of an entrepreneurial spirit about me, that just kind of was there. So when it came to real estate, when it came to working for someone else, even the church is still an employer, right? And you're still doing something for somebody else. I always had this inner bent that I wanted to do something on my own at some point, right? And I like the freedom of having my own business. Freedom. That's a little bit maybe oxymoron to say that that's freedom, but it is in another sense, right? If you're working for yourself, setting your own schedule. I don't work as hard as my parents did. that was that was very exhausting with your restaurant doors being open 7 days a week. We used to always try to tell my dad, you could close on Sundays. He would, he was the worship leader in our church. My mom was playing the piano. We were there Sunday morning, and then we'd rush out the door to go open up restaurant doors, right? Right after church, and off we'd go. And that was the week. And so, but we always said you could close it on Sundays, and no, you could never do that. That's, everybody's out for dinner on Sundays. And well, Chick-fil-A proved that wrong, didn't they?
Well, if business is hard, and it is, I think the restaurant business is especially hard. But that's neat. I didn't know that. I've never heard that from your story. I do think that probably does shine some light on an influence in your life towards entrepreneurship and kind of an independent direction that you chose for yourself.
I was waiting tables at 10. I was hiring individuals at 15 and doing the scheduling for my parents. So like I was definitely a part of it, you know, all the way through childhood.
Interesting. So tell me this: were you more of a saver or a spender? Did you gravitate one towards the other, more to one than the other?
I don't I was probably a little bit more of the spender. Yes.
Okay. And one of the reasons why I said is because I like to ask that question of people. I'm the spender. I that's where I fit in. When you were talking about paying off debt multiple times and having charts up. So who's putting charts up?
Well, that was me.
Interesting. Okay. So okay. All right. So you're maybe a structured spender. You're an organized spender. You're a note taking spender.
But I will tell you, there was a major mindset shift for me when I started doing real estate that was helpful, even in just the whole idea of cash flow being more important than that accumulation. There was another piece, and that was learning how much of a consumer I had been. And, we consume goods thinking that we need to wear certain clothes or drive certain cars or whatever. And we were never extravagant that way, but, we like to have a decent standard of all of that. But my mindset shifted when it was like, wait, instead of buying liabilities, I need to be buying assets. So guess what? I can forego that extra pair of shoes. I do love shoes, okay? I'm a woman through and through here, okay? A lot of pairs of shoes in my closet. I decided I could buy apartments or houses instead. And then they could pay for my shoes. So once I kind of grasped that concept, it was like that whole year I was buying houses, one year in particular when I started doing that. I don't think I hardly bought a single consumer good because I was so busy buying these assets that it kind of shifted that right out of my mindset, if that makes sense, right? Like it's way more fun to buy cash flowing assets that are actually going to produce for you for years into the future. And once I kind of grasped that, that really helped me to not even worry about, we're so busy sometimes in this country, I think, looking rich instead of actually being wealthy because we're so busy just with appearances and trying to keep up with the Joneses next door. And we did fall into that a lot when I was when we were married and with our kids were little. We buy a house and we were now on this pretty street on this cul-de-sac, and we got 7 kids, and the neighbors next door are double income, no kids, and we're trying to keep up with them. Do you know what I'm saying? And that was just not possible. And that would be what would throw us into debt the next time around. We bought another house. We'd go move to a new duty station. Well, now you got to put furniture in that house. Well, now we got to paint it and make it pretty. Just all the things. And that would toss us right back into that situation.
Awesome. Yeah, no, when you were describing earlier that one year, let's say, where you did the 2 house flips, I mean, for an individual, especially if you're doing a lot of the work, all of the work, most of the work, I mean, 2 houses in a year is moving. I mean, for anybody that does that or has, that's a lot. And then when you do remember, oh yeah, by the way, single parenting, several children that you're homeschooling at the same time, right? So it's not even like they're all getting dropped off and hey, I've got these 7 hours, 6 hours, 8 hours to, so all that stuff at the same time.
At that point, when I was doing the houses, my kids were no longer homeschooling. I will say that they were getting older, but I was working full time. My oldest son was helping me with it, But I was working a good 50 hours a week directing children's ministry at a mega church. It was a big job. But we'd get home 5 o'clock, work till 10 p.m. every night of the week and weekends. I was exhausted. I was exhausted. It was a lot of fun. We learned a lot. It was a great experience. I wouldn't give that up for the world. And my son and I, especially, we have some really fond memories, but we don't want to do that anymore.
I understand.
I'll hire it out from now on.
I understand that too. I love it. Well, then tell me some more. Yeah, so I wanted to mention that because that's just cool. And we help people right now that are in so many different stages of life. Settings are unique, and so I was just trying to appreciate what I'm learning about you and hearing from you. Take me back though to some of those takeaways then, I guess, as you're having these epiphanies or these revelations along the way, like that whole concept of assets versus liabilities. I remember that. I remember what that was like to pick that up from reading Rich Dad Poor Dad. For me, it was in 2015. Actually, the same year that I read Becoming Your Own Banker was when I was exposed to a lot of those other great books that you mentioned. Richest Man in Babylon, The Cash Flow Quadrant. So what else then can you remember? Like sometimes I wonder if I don't like the Cash Flow Quadrants book even more than Rich Dad Poor Dad, but I don't have to compare them, but I'm just saying it was also a very impactful book to me. So you've had jobs, you've worked in businesses. What were some of your other takeaways as you're reading this stuff and doing this stuff?
Well, I think exactly. I think it's such an important concept. And Robert Kiyosaki made that super simple for me. What is the difference between an asset and a liability? And that gets really confused, right? When people go to the bank to get a loan, they're told to write down all of their assets, and they include in there their primary residence or their cars. And when you learn Robert Kiyosaki's definition, which I think is the true definition, right? Cash flowing assets are things that put money in your pocket. Liabilities, take them out of your pocket. And I was like, that is such a brilliant and simple definition. That means that my primary residence is costing me money every month and maintenance and all of those things. So my house is not really an asset unless I move out of it and let somebody else move in and pay me rent to pay for that mortgage and actually have additional cash flow left over, right? Then it becomes an asset, putting money in my pocket. So I think just learning some of those basic things, that's what got me on the rental property thing. But then when you come along and you start learning infinite banking and you go, now, wait a minute, the way this dividend paying right there, right? You're getting dividends, paying whole life insurance contract is set up. This too is a cash flowing asset, right? It is putting money in my pocket. Now, the first couple of years, yes, there's this capitalization phase, right? But it is like the startup of a small business, the banking business, as Nelson says, but that thing is going to compound and grow and pay dividends on this exponential curve well into the future for the rest of your life. Not to mention all of the other amazing benefits. And so when I think it just kind of was like a change, once I got into the mindset shift of cash flowing assets, then that just sort of fell right into place right alongside it. Because now it's almost like, well, that can almost be like a rental property, except now I don't have to paint and swing a hammer and fix toilets and vet people for tenants and make sure I'm going to actually, receive that rental income. Oh, now I've got a vacancy. Now I might not get it this next month. That's not how this works, right? This is consistent. It may start out a little smaller in the beginning, but it's consistent and it never stops and it's guaranteed. And so it was not hard for my mind, I guess, to just make that connection, make that shift. And then when you start to realize, oh, it can also be the basis for going ahead and buying more rental properties if you want to. I mean, it just grows from there in your understanding, right, of how this works. And so I just saw it and was like, this is fantastic. I want to know more about this. And so I started a whole nother deep dive of studying all about the infinite banking concept after that.
So help me out with my timelines, help me out with your thinking, help me out with all of it. Working for the church, fixing and flipping. Did you always have, so prior to any of this stuff, did you have a tendency to read about things or to study things or learn things, or was this like the beginning of a starting race where, oh no, this is an inspiration and I'm running from here on?
Well, to be fair, have you ever taken the Strengths Finders test?
I I don't think I've taken the one you're describing. No, is that what it's called? Strengths Finders test?
Called the Strengths Finders test, yeah.
No.
And while I was working at the church, we all had to take this. You know, it's like one of those things when you're working somewhere and they all want to know your personalities, what your strengths, all these things are. Well, it's interesting to me that there's like 35 strengths. My number one is learner. So it kind of, maybe I have an unfair advantage there. If that's my strength, it's because I do love to learn. I was going through divorce, taking my master's degree. Back when my Hannah was born, she was my fourth child. I was in the hospital writing an appellate brief when I was studying law. So it's like,
What? All right, so I forgot about the masters. Fill me in. Writing anything. That's crazy. I can't even repeat what you said. Something about appellate law. You lost me. I remember those two words, appellate law.
no, I had taken a paralegal degree somewhere back in the day. Like I said, after I had about 3 kids, I was still stay-at-home mom, but I was going to school and I did that. And then I thought I was going to be a paralegal. Well, I really wanted to be an attorney. I went the paralegal route because it was easier at the time just to kind of get my foot in the toe in the water. I never did wind up following through with that. That had always been my dream, was to be an attorney. Never ever wound up doing that. But I loved it. I loved studying the law. I loved writing. I wound up getting my English degree as a bachelor's, and then I wound up doing a master's in English literature. I don't know why I have done all of these different detours. I have a tendency, this is not necessarily a good thing, but instead of going from point A to point B, I go round robin. And eventually, I think for a long time, because I was a stay-at-home mom and I had kind of put off my own career, and I had always had that desire to be an attorney. Like that's what I wanted to do back when I was 16 and I went to college. But never having actually done that, I struggled with what am I going to do with the rest of my life? I feel like I'm a little too old to go back to law school now and that kind of thing, But I'm so glad in so many ways that I didn't, because when I found the infinite banking concept and the ability to help people do this, I am so content. This is like I have finally found what it is that I want to do with the rest of my life. And I have no thought of it's ever going to change. Like this is absolute contentment in this space. And, so apparently all the other things that I thought I was going to do, I was going to be a college professor when I got the master's in literature. That didn't happen, but it's okay because I absolutely love what I'm doing right now.
Of course. All right. So I am curious about this then. Do you have a favorite piece? And we're not at the rapid fire questions, but I got to know now. Do you have a favorite piece of literature, story, book? What's in the top for you?
Oh, yes, I have always loved George Eliot's Middlemarch as just kind of the quintessential long Victorian novel.
Okay.
So, and I actually also love her Mill on the Floss. But it's been a long time.
Okay. Well, that's fine because I don't know either of those. So I'm glad I asked because I can go back and I can start pursuing that. I'm always adding to my reading list. I mean, you and I were talking books before we hit record, I think. Oh, hey, what are you reading? What am I reading? So, all right, cool, cool, cool. All right, so start connecting the dots, the background, your history in coming up. You get exposed to velocity banking first. So I'm curious, what were your takeaways there? What was helpful to you? But then as you did a search, like you said you went to Google and did a search about things that, you were exposed to infinite banking from velocity banking. So you pursued that. You were curious, so you pursued that. So I want to know, what did that pursuit look like? What did you like right away? What did you not understand completely right away? What did you have to work through? Paint that picture for me.
So velocity banking kind of takes this idea. You can take a line of credit, whether that's a line of credit like just a personal line of credit or home equity line of credit. And essentially, you're using that. You can take over other debts with that. There's a lot of people who will, even use it to accelerate their mortgage by putting it on a home equity line of credit rather than, like there's a first lien position line of credit that you can get and take over your entire mortgage. I have never done that. I have investigated all of that. I do think that technically it works mathematically because the interest, the way it's calculated is different because it's on a daily rate. So if you paycheck park on that home equity line of credit and put all of your income coming in the early parts of the month, then you got several days where the interest is not as much, and then you pay your bills later on in the month, especially if you specifically go in and call up all your creditors and say, I want my payment due, the 28th of the month or something like that, then you can kind of, it's kind of a way to get rid of your debts, crush them, all on a line of credit in order to reduce that interest first. And then, of course, it rises back up as you pay your bills. But hopefully, if you've got enough cash flow, you can do it again the next month and it just crushes that down faster. That's kind of the basic idea. So I was kind of curious about that, played with that a little bit. I had a home equity line of credit. I had used that to purchase my first property. I had, run up the line of credit and all of that, used it, refinanced it, had the money back, so I had my line of credit open to do it again, that kind of idea. I think the biggest takeaway from that for me was just this idea that there are products out there that maybe operate a little bit differently than your standard, like the difference between a mortgage with its amortization and all the interest up front and your the payment is this fixed payment kind of thing versus the line of credit where, yes, it may be a variable rate, but it's all about, it has a little bit of that volume of interest piece in it, right? Um, but so this idea that you could just by redirecting how you handled your money, where you put it first, that it could actually make an improvement in your financial system, situation without you having to work any harder to actually earn more money was just kind of fascinating to me. So I'm like, well, how can I be more efficient with the dollars that I have? How can I make my dollars work harder? That kind of went along with a little bit of the stuff that I was reading in The Richest Man in Babylon, in this idea that you want to get your dollars working for you so that you're not the only one working, right? We only have so many hours in a day, so much strength, so much skill. I needed my dollars to start working for me. So that was part of the whole thing with the rental properties. But then there was this idea that even without a rental property, just the banking system and the way money works. And so I never wound up going full on in that because I discovered infinite banking pretty quickly on the heels of that. And when I did, I was like, this is safer because one of Nelson's golden rules, right, is don't do business with banks. So one of the problems with velocity banking is you're still relying on a third-party bank. And there's always the threat that if the bank decides they're the ones in control and they can freeze that HELOC. And then all of that paycheck you just parked on that thing, and now it's frozen. Now how am I going to pay my bills at the end of the month? You know? So it was kind of like, ooh, you could play with that as long as you got some safety net over on the other side somewhere. But to do that only and to put yourself in that position, especially when you're watching stuff in the economy and you're like, I'm not sure with everything that's going on politically, economically. So there were times even, I was looking at some of that and we had just gone into COVID, right? And I had seen, because the second house that I had done, I had borrowed private money to do that house. Fortunately, because this was an acquaintance that I had made and a friend and a human, right? When COVID hit, all of a sudden, at the time, I was supposed to refinance that property and pay her back. And I suddenly couldn't. For about 3 or 4 weeks, you could not get an investor loan. And it took a few weeks. And I called her up and I was like, I think we're going to miss the deadline. What's going to happen? And she could technically foreclose on me because we had agreed to 6 months. And she said, don't worry. I'm not worried about it. Relax. It'll change. We'll get it done. And that was a huge thing right there. I was like, oh, that relationship was so important. I realized how important it was to have that relationship. Whereas, with a bank that you don't have a relationship with, where you're just kind of another number on their spreadsheet, that wasn't going to be quite such a kind situation, right? But anyway, so we got through that. I managed to get her paid back. She was super gracious and all was well. But there was things like that made me go, oh, yeah, dealing with banks is great when everything's great. But when something comes along and surprises you, then it might not be so great. And so even that with the velocity banking, that was a huge piece for me. It was like, I don't want to have someone else in control. As long as somebody else is in control, that means I'm not in control. And I want to always be in control of my funds as much as humanly possible, right? So that was kind of a little lesson in there as well.
No, I appreciate it. I appreciate the breakdown, and I appreciate you sharing your experience. I view that whole concept of velocity banking as a boon to the general public in this regard. At least there's a message out there that's outside of the conventional way of doing things, that's at least asking you to consider what you pointed out, which is, where are you deciding to put your money first? Because most people just, okay, I direct deposit at the bank, I pay my bills, and then I live off of, whatever's left over is the normal route. So at least it's causing people to think and perhaps run the math and, be calculated, but possibly do yourself a favor by just asking, okay, yeah, where does the money go first? But I would even say, though, when someone is exposed to infinite banking, I believe that they could see, like and you can see, that Nelson's first principle of thinking long range and even his second principle of not being afraid to capitalize play into pointing out infinite banking as the superior way of financing, because if you're using velocity banking to get out of debt, and again, I'm not bashing it. Again, I'm saying that could be a better decision than conventional finance. Could be. But what happens next? Are we thinking long range? I mean, really thinking generationally if we're only looking at paying off debt. So while it could be a more efficient way of paying off debt because of its advantages, awesome, but then there's something else, right? And then when you realize that, well, it's my capitalizing there where that money's going to do that job for me in a more efficient way, but then it's still gone. It's
right.
So it's actually not capitalizing for me. It's being more efficient with my cash flow, sure, but it's actually not helping me create anything intergenerationally. It's not actually helping me to capitalize now and maintain the power of the principle that I am building up in the meantime. So interesting. Okay, interesting insight. Any other thought there? Because then I'm going to ask you about.
Yeah, because I was just thinking what you're saying. Like we were so focused so much of our lives on just getting out of debt. Right? And that just gets you to zero. And that's where so many people are, right? And then they never get past that. And yes, it's better to get to zero than to be in a lot of debt, especially a lot of consumer debt. But it is a total mindset shift. And I think even some of my clients, and I know I've struggled with this too, like when you do the infinite banking concept, I believe it was Mary Jo who has said, if you're not having to take out loans, policy loans with your infinite banking system, then you're probably not paying enough premium. So, so so there's this thing of we get so into this short-sighted mindset about paying off loans and getting to zero, but that then when we start doing the infinite banking concept, we're scared to death to take a loan. But now we don't have to be afraid to take a loan. Yes, we want to be honest bankers. Yes, we want to pay them back. We want to have a plan. We want to have that provision. But at the end of the day, it is so hard to think like a banker because we're so not used to being in that position, right? To be the one that is actually approving the loan, right? Setting up the terms of the payback, giving that permission to do that. We have to give ourselves permission to do that in so many ways. So there's just so many things here that take a mindset shift, I guess is what I'm trying to get at. And that we just, it was so short-sighted, at least with the infinite banking concept. If we get to the end of the day and we don't get a loan paid off by the time we graduate this earth, as Nelson would say, oh well, it's going to be taken care of. Our death benefit is far going to exceed that anyways, so that's also part of that long range thinking, right? We don't have to sweat that near like we do when we're in debt to somebody else.
That was helpful for me to hear. I don't believe that I've heard that saying from Mary Jo, and I love listening to her stuff, have for years. Let me make sure I heard this right. If you haven't taken a policy loan, maybe you're not paying enough premium.
I think somebody else quoted that from her to me, so let me just caveat that.
That's fine. I love it. But if I tracked right, if you're not taking a policy loan, you're probably not paying enough premium. In my own words, do I have that right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I like that.
Like that requirement to take a policy loan, right? It's a little bit like I recently had a conversation with a new client. He's about the third year in, and he's had savings to pay for his premium. He's a business owner, small business. He's like, but I'm not sure where year four's premium is going to come from, right? And so because the mindset is, I've got this 10% set aside for savings, and so this is my savings account. Well, yes, that's a great place to start, but how in the world is that ever going to work if we're going to do what Nelson says, and income is going to equal premium 20 years down the road? You're going to have to take and borrow policy loans to live your life. Just like when you're using a third-party bank, you make deposits and you make withdrawals to pay your bills. And then you make deposits again, and then you make withdrawals again. You know what I'm saying? It's that using it as cash flow. So having to kind of get outside of the mindset of it's the 10% cream on the top of your income that you can live without forever. And instead, starting to see where you're putting in, a much greater portions of your income in and out of this system. So there's got to be policy loans involved in order to really do that.
That's so funny. This fellow's thinking about where his fourth year premium is coming from, and I'm certain that I was trying to think of where my first policy premium was all going to come from. So if you got value out of this video, make sure to subscribe to the channel here, and I'll see you on the next video.